So today, talk about the Great Depression and the New Deal. And of course, in particular, how these affect Black Americans. In terms of the Great Depression, I will kind of lay out a little bit of what are the causes of the Depression. And this is an interesting thing in the current situation in which we find ourselves. You know, when I talk about the effects of the Depression in years past, I will talk about these catastrophic numbers, the likes of which America has never seen, and yet we're seeing them now. We're living in the midst of another economic catastrophe that is in some ways equally bad. But what we'll talk about with the New Deal, there are safeguards put in place. There's a safety net, if you will, put in place that ensures that the next time that America goes through an economic downturn, which is inevitable, that it won't be as bad. It could never be as bad as the Great Depression was in the 1930s. But as we'll see here, particularly for this class, the ravages of the Depression are particularly hard on Black Americans. And the relief that the New Deal provides does not tend to reach African Americans. And so, whereas we'll look at, all of the positive things that the New Deal does, we'll need to look too at where it fell short, particularly for Black people in America. So first of all, in terms of causes, there are many. I think regrettably, there seems to be this misunderstanding that in the 1920s in America, the economy was wonderful. America had come out of the Great War, had returned to normalcy, as they said, and rolled back the regulations the government had to put in place during the war to fight and win the war. And business was booming. The Republican Party was in power. They were the party of big business. And everything was great, and then the stock market crashes and it all comes crashing down. But let me just say plainly, it's a lot more complicated than that. The stock market crash of 1929 does not cause by itself the Great Depression. And even if it did, there are fundamental causes of that crash. But further, that occurs in 1929. The Depression does not reach its nadir, or if you recall what that word means from the early part of the semester, its very worst low point until 1932. So there's a lot going on between 1929 and 32. The U.S. is in an economic downward spiral. As we've seen this past year, when times get hard, and when you're suffering from the effects of these, what have been called structural flaws in America's economy, where for 10 years rather, companies or corporations have been making more and more and more profits, but people aren't making higher wages, and eventually they find out they don't have the purchasing power they used to have. And they might want to roll back on that idea that America has developed as a consumer culture that, you need all these different products to make your life easier and better. Well, maybe you only need food on your table at night and clothes on your back and a room to sleep in. And people stop buying stuff. And especially if companies see that they're not selling as much stuff and they have to lay people off or cut their wages and hours, they cut back even more, and that's fewer people that have money to go out and spend on frivolous things, and it becomes a downward spiral. It becomes a cycle where people are not purchasing, so companies aren't selling, and so they have to lay people off or cut people's hours and wages, and that further erodes the aggregate purchasing power of America's consumers, and so on. While at the same time, people start worrying so much about the financial state of things that people start to panic and make bank runs. That is, if they got all their savings in a local bank, and rumors start to spread that that bank has maybe made bad investments and is at risk of going under, they rush down there and get their money out before it does. But when everybody does that at the same time, what happens? Of course, the bank does fail because everybody went and got their damn money out. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. In any case, the effects are profound. America by 1932 reaches 25% unemployment, which again used to be unheard of until it just happened this year. Again, in this case, 13 million people out of work. The GDP, or gross domestic product, the measure of how much America produces, is very nearly cut in half. It's cut by at least a third. Corporations have to close down plants, cut production. Production in some industries goes down by 75%. People are dependent upon charity and bread lines and soup kitchens to eat, feed their families. People are evicted. Commodity prices collapse, and by that I mean in particular farm commodity, agricultural commodities, the price of wheat, cotton, etc. These things collapse, and so farmers, even when they can sell these commodities, are not making enough to pay their mortgage. They're not making enough to pay the rent, pay the money on their land. And if you have a mortgage on that land, that means the bank technically owns it. And when you can't make the payments, that means you're gone and it belongs to the bank. People get foreclosed upon. But let's talk about more specifically how this affects black people in America. Now, some people will refer to the 1920s not just as the jazz age, but the roaring 20s. And other historians have liked to point out that they weren't so roaring for a lot of America, meaning it wasn't this prosperous, great time for a lot of Americans. And that would certainly hold true for most black people, many of whom were poor in the 1920s, suffered from, obviously, oppression, Jim Crow in the South, racial violence throughout the country, as we saw in the last lecture, and so on. But if we look at the South in particular, the price of cotton had remained so low because foreign demand was down and cotton farmers in the United States were overproducing, so you had this surplus of cotton on the market. That's going to kill the price. And during the downward spiral that I was just talking about, the price of cotton collapses from 18 cents a pound to 6 cents a pound by 1933. And remember, many of the folks that are black in the South are tenant farmers working on cotton plantations and farms owned by white people. This is at the same time that you have mechanization in agriculture, machines that allow fewer people to do more work. And you put all this together, it means that a lot of those black tenant farmers were getting evicted, and they have nowhere to go but to cities in the South, Atlanta, Birmingham, Jackson, Mississippi, Memphis, so on, New Orleans. But there are no jobs there. And things are bad enough that even what had traditionally been reliable, quote-unquote, Negro jobs, like garbage collector, for example, those are going to white people because they ain't got no jobs either. Now, when I said in 1932 that the nadir unemployment for the United States hits 25%, well, for black people, it's 50%. Half of the African Americans that are in the workforce and looking for a job in 1932 are unemployed. That's catastrophic. The presidential election occurs in the midst of this economic catastrophe, and the incumbent Republican president, Herbert Hoover, is destroyed in that election by Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR. Democrat of New York, who had promised the American people a New Deal and a series of federal programs that would be aimed at relief, recovery, and reform. They didn't know exactly during the campaign what, specific programs maybe, or what all at least specific programs they would implement, but they knew this would be under the umbrella of those concepts of relief, recovery, and reform. Relief for people who need help, recovery for the economy, and reform of the system to make sure, again, like I said at the onset, next time there's an economic downturn or recession, it doesn't get so bad as this catastrophic Great Depression. The emphasis for the New Deal would be on, or the emphases would be on creating jobs using federal government money. In fact, in engaging in what they call deficit spending, purposefully having the federal government spend more money than it was bringing in, because the federal government's in a unique position to be able to do that when things are this bad. Not normally, you wouldn't want it normally. But when you are in a Great Depression such as this, the federal government is in the unique position to spend more than it makes to lubricate the economy, to prime the pump, as they would say, to jumpstart America's economy, stimulus. And you've seen snippets of that in the economic crisis in which we find ourselves this year. So, creating jobs, deficit spending, try to fix the problem as they saw it of under-consumption. When I say consumption, I mean in the economic sense. Consumers consume, which means they buy things. And if people don't have jobs, they can't buy things. And if people can't buy things, companies can't make money, right? So you get money in the hands of people by getting them jobs, send them perhaps direct payment, as we've seen this year, so they go out and spend that money. And also look at it from the flip side, and especially in terms of agriculture, economically speaking, there's underconsumption. Well, the flip side of that would be overproducing. You're producing too much. The demand is not there. So in terms of agriculture, they try to look at it and say, how can we get farmers to cut production of cotton or wheat or whatever it may be? Could we subsidize them or pay them, maybe even not to grow certain crops? And then finally, a further emphasis will be on restoring confidence to the American people in the system. And I guess all of this would fall under goals and strategy of the New Deal. What I've been talking about, the emphases on creating jobs, boosting consumption, perhaps cutting production, deficit spending, restoring confidence in the system. This is particularly important when you look at America's banking system and financial system. The stock market had completely collapsed by 1932. What happened? This is another thing. People think, well, Black Tuesday, 1929, stock market crash, and then we're in a depression. Well, the stock market crashed. If you look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the average of major stocks that we still use to kind of look at the health of America's financial system, it collapses way further than it did in October 1929. But people had lost faith in the stock market. Nobody wanted to put their money in there. And this is after decades of nothing but growth in the stock market in America's economy. It's another one of the causes of all this. People had been lulled by the late 20s into this thought that America had entered this period of more or less permanent economic growth, and the stock market was absolute guaranteed money. Not so. So you had to restore confidence in that, and also in America's banking system. By 1932, there had been, I don't know what the number is, but 5,000 plus probably bank failures. And think about back then, there's no deposit insurance like we have now. So if you had all of your life savings in the Covington local bank, and they made some bad choices and they go under, and you didn't get your money out before they go under, your money's gone. You're not getting it back. And when you think about that and the collapse of the stock market, you have to realize that this Great Depression, unlike what we're going through now, which mostly just affects poor working class and lower middle class type people, back then we had millionaires that were ruined because all their money was in the stock market, or some bank failed and your life savings is in there. If you're a solidly upper middle class person, you're ruined if all that bank goes under. So what are just a snapshot of some programs associated with the New Deal before we home in on its effect on Black Americans? There are federal work relief programs. The federal government decides to use its ability to engage in deficit spending to give people jobs. People didn't just want a handout from the government, they wanted to work. And so the government decides they could put people to work at public works projects, things that would be good for the general public. And so you have programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is a work program for young men, especially in kind of a pseudo, military type barracks environment, that would work on parks and build roads and other infrastructure. And a much larger version of that later, the Works Progress Administration, of the WPA, which over the course of its lifetime employs some 13 million people, which would perhaps not coincidentally equal the number of people unemployed at the height of the Depression. They also work on public works type projects, again, working on like parks, state, city parks, national parks, roads, bridges, infrastructure. They build, federal facilities all throughout the country. There's scarcely a city in America that you can go to that doesn't have a federal building or a U.S. courthouse that wasn't built or that was built by the WPA or under the auspices of the WPA. WPA also reaches out and puts skilled workers to work using their skills. Like there's a federal writers program and a federal artist program that puts these people to work, engaging them in work that would utilize whatever particular skills they have. So you have artists painting murals in cities, and you have writers out of work, people like me, like historians who would go into the South in a federal program and interview people who had been slaves that are now like 80, 90 years old and publish their interviews and transcripts so that we have this gold mine of sources looking into what it was like to be a slave in the South and so on. Additionally, there are regulations put in place, especially to get at this goal of restoring confidence in the system. The FDIC is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This is what we still have to insure our money in banks. If your money is in a bank, it's protected by the FDIC. That means if that bank were to somehow fail, you could get your money back because the government insures that. So there's no need to ever make a bank run again. No need to ever run down to the bank fearful that it's going to fail and your money's going to be gone. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. For the stock market, there is the SEC, which is also still around, the Securities and Exchange Commission. The SEC oversees trading in the stock market, licenses investors. It forces any publicly traded corporation, that is any company that sells its stock to you or me or whomever, they have to every quarter, every 3 months, 4 times a year, they have to disclose a statement of their financial situation. Like, here's the revenue we're bringing in, here's what we're spending, here's our projection for next quarter, so that anyone who would want to invest can read those reports and invest with confidence. And typically, when you hear about the SEC in the news these days, it's because some corporation has cheated on these reports, or somebody in the company is engaged in insider trading or so on. Those are among the things things that are implemented in the first year or two of Roosevelt rolling out the New Deal. By the second half of his first term, they step a little bit further out and begin to fashion America as a welfare state. Now that word welfare has become loaded, and since the 1960s in America, it has come to mean, well, it's come to be used pejoratively, that is negatively, one, and two, it refers to a specific program that's traced to the 1960s. What it means here is something much bigger. When we say you are a welfare state, and America isn't really fully one, we have kind of elements of being one. It means that the government takes on some responsibility for the general welfare, the well-being of its most vulnerable citizens. So if you're a welfare state, that means your government takes on the responsibility for the general welfare or well-being of your most vulnerable citizens. In this case, if the government is taking on that responsibility of protecting the well-being or welfare of most vulnerable citizens, who are the most vulnerable citizens that are protected under Social Security, which is implemented this time? The elderly, for one. Social Security is a government-run program that essentially provides a retirement plan for elderly people. But this is different now, and let me just say, with deficit spending and things like these work relief programs, that was never intended to be permanent. You can't just deficit spend forever, although we seem to do that in America. Social Security was supposed to be permanent, and we still have it, and so how is it funded? It's not just funded by the government saying spend our money. How is Social Security funded? By you and me. You pay into it, so it's taxpayer funded, and you get to draw out of it when you're older and retire, right? But also, I mean, if we're thinking about the Depression here and its effects, who are really immediately, you think of the most vulnerable citizens, other than in this class, obviously Black Americans, but more generally the unemployed. And so unemployment insurance is provided for through Social Security. That's one of the things, if you think about the economic catastrophe in which we currently find ourselves, if it were pre-Depression, I mean, it could be a lot worse. At least now, we have things like the FDIC and we have unemployment insurance. So many of, not all, but many of the millions of people who have lost their jobs in 2020 have been able to get access to at least some kind of relief from the government, right? Well, that's because of the New Deal. That make sense? Mm-hmm. Finally here, for labor and for agriculture, with the New Deal, they try some different things to reach out to the labor movement as working class people, and some of them are unsuccessful, some of them get ruled unconstitutional. What ends up coming out of it that is enduring is the Wagner Act, which is otherwise known as the Fair Labor Standards Act. I'm sorry, in addition to the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Wagner Act is the National Labor Relations Act. You don't need to write that down. What you can write down is that the Wagner Act creates the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board. The NLRB exists to mediate disputes between workers who might go on strike, organized labor, and their employers. That may not seem like a big idea or a big deal, but the Wagner Act and the creation of the NLRB guarantees workers' rights to join a union and gives the union then the ability to go to the government to mediate whatever disputes they have with their employers. This is enormous at that time because we're coming out of a period of decades where if government ever got involved in strikes, it was to send the army out to break up the striking workers. Government had been no friend at all, for the most part, to organized labor and working class people up to this point. So this is a sea change. And then with the Fair Labor Standards Act, you guys go into your workplace, wherever it may be, assuming that you have not been laid off during the pandemic, and you will see posted on the wall somewhere in the break room probably a piece of paper that says, here are your workers' rights under the Fair Labor Standards Act or the FLSA. Minimum wage, 40-hour work week, meaning you get overtime if you have to work over 40 hours in a given 7-day week. Regulations against child labor. None of these things existed for the 1930s and the New Deal. And then finally, the AAA is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. This program, the AAA, aims at that problem of farmers producing too much of a certain crop. And if you guys have had basic micro econ, and which you maybe suffered through, and you probably remember at least that when you have overproduction, that is, people, firms, in this case farmers, are producing too much of a commodity, be it wheat, cotton, or whatever, livestock, apples, oranges, then there is demand for that. That is what consumers are wanting and needing and willing to pay for. Then you have a surplus, and that kills the price. And that's what had happened in agricultural sectors in America. So what the AAA does is kind of the reverse of these work relief programs that tend to boost consumption. The effort here was to cut production. And so the AAA pays farmers not to grow certain crops. Says, oh, you're a wheat farmer, well, there's a glut in the wheat market. Here's a government stipend or check for you to get through this year, pay your bills, feed your family, but you can't bring your wheat to market this year. Well, you planted it already? Okay, we'll destroy it. Got livestock that are going to market? Well, put them down. Got oranges on the tree? Well, burn them. And you can't go to market, and here's a stipend for you to get through. And then this works in terms of, it seems kind of absurd if you have people starving and you're storing foodstuffs. But, the government doesn't have the logistical ability to process that stuff. And so, from a strictly economic standpoint, the easier thing to do is simply ensure that those goods don't go to market. Questions about any of that? I'm not going to ask you anything super detailed on that and probably spent way too much time on it. But here we are. Let's talk about where the New Deal fell short for African Americans specifically. There is racial discrimination evident in probably most New Deal programs. And I want you to consider one thing from the onset. Franklin Roosevelt is a Democrat, right? Now, we know that the Republican Party had been created as the party intending to prevent slavery from expanding and so on. And it's the party, through Abraham Lincoln that gives you the 13th Amendment and the 14th and 15th, and yet we also know what happens in the redemption period. And we know that in the South, the party that takes control and institutes white supremacy is the Democratic Party. And that's Roosevelt's party. Don't lose sight of that. That means that whatever Roosevelt does through this New Deal, if he starts to try to include something that would directly reach out to black people, especially in the South, to better their position and threaten thereby white supremacy, he's going to lose all the white Southerners in his party. He's not going to be able to get elected again. Does that make sense? The South by then was what we call the Solid South, which means white Democrats control it. And Democrats that are from New York or somewhere else, they depend upon those white Southern Democrats. So the New Deal, in Roosevelt's mind, could not include specific provisions for civil rights. Now, there are some things that Roosevelt does later that would maybe begin to tiptoe towards that, and certainly his successor in office, Harry Truman, takes it a little further. But there was never anything truly systematically designed to alleviate the plight of poor black people in the South, or to get at civil rights directly. That makes sense? Speaking of which, talk about FDR later in his presidency. Y'all know how many times he got elected? It'll never happen again because we amended the Constitution. He gets elected 4 times, which means, well, he dies early in the 4th term, so he would have served 16 years in office. He serves at least 12. But point being, he's there for quite a long time, and yes, or by the end when America's in World War II, they begin to, and then his vice president becomes president when he dies, Truman, they begin to consider some kind of civil rights measures. But we ain't there yet. And we'll see what happens when they do, vis-a-vis the white South. So, racial discrimination in New Deal programs. Take the AAA, for example, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Those stipends that go to farmers not to grow certain crops, well, those go to landowning farmers. And if you look at the South, remember there had never been a program for land redistribution. Land was never systematically taken from white landowners and given over to former slaves, so most black people in the South are sharecroppers. They're tenant farmers living on some white person's land. Theoretically, the money that is given to the landowning farmers is supposed to trickle down to their tenants. But who's responsible for dispersing that and making sure it happens? The states. You think the state of Georgia or the state of Alabama at that time, controlled by white supremacist Democrats, was going to make sure that happened? No. And what ends up happening instead is many of these people get evicted, again, as I alluded to earlier, and then they go to cities where there ain't no jobs to have there either, and the jobs that there are going to white people first. Consider, too, there's a federal housing administration created during this time that arranged for and backed mortgages and loans for people buying homes, but it would only back loans for black people for black neighborhoods and for white people in white neighborhoods. Integrated areas or neighborhoods or any that were not solidly black or white were called areas with, quote, inharmonious racial groups and considered unfit for lending. The FHA created what you see here, residential security maps, which indicated which areas were preferred for giving loans out to people to buy homes. They used what's become known as redlining to discourage lending for homes in black neighborhoods. Cities were color-coded. You had like areas A, B, C, D, and D was the too risky to lend. Well, that was the black neighborhood. And so you have what we would call now a color-masked form of discrimination. They're not outright saying in print on the page, this is the black neighborhood, don't lend money to these people to buy homes. I mean, ironically, they are using color, but it's not black and white. But they just call this, this is not desirable to lend to residents in this particular neighborhood. This is Atlanta, by the way. That's a red line map of Atlanta from that time. It look a little different now, of course. So segregation is exacerbated through this program, and almost all the money funneled through this program go to white people. Urban decay is accelerated through this. And then consider, too, that agricultural and domestic workers were often excluded from both Social Security and the Wagner Act and Fair Labor Standards Act. Of course, those are two of the most common types of jobs that black people had. So if you're a domestic person, a domestic servant, is somebody who goes, a maid, if you will, somebody who tends to some wealthier middle-class white person's home, you don't qualify for Social Security. You don't qualify to join a union. You don't qualify for the protections of the FLSA that we mentioned earlier. And the same would go to wage-earning farm workers, tenant farmers, and so on. All that making sense? Question about anything? So there are efforts, to be sure, to include within the New Deal, some kind of, at minimum, some kinds of non-discrimination clauses in some of this legislation, but it doesn't work. Remember, the solid white South would refuse to back any civil rights legislation or anything that would threaten the status quo of white supremacy in the South. And the solid South is a key constituency for the Democratic Party and for FDR. Now, the NAACP and the Urban League do try to pressure Roosevelt's administration, and they do find at least one eager ear, one welcome listener in the form of the First Lady, the wife of President Roosevelt, Eleanor, who made strong, meaningful connections to some black leaders and pushed for the inclusion of African Americans in government. And she had, no small measure of influence over her husband. One of the individuals with whom she makes a meaningful connection, we'll spotlight here briefly, is Mary McLeod Bethune. She was born in 1875, lives until 1955. She'd been born to a former slave cotton farmer family in South Carolina. So she's among freedom's first generation, as we looked at earlier. She attends seminary, so she was going to go and work in the church, but she could not get a missionary sponsor, and so became instead a teacher and moved to Chicago. So she's also part of the Great Migration that we've looked at. But she actually moves back to the South, moving to Palatka, Florida, that's near Jacksonville, where she eventually opens a boarding school on the coast east of Palatka and Daytona. The Daytona Educational and Industrial Training School for Negro Girls. You don't have to write all that down. Because this would later merge with a boys' college nearby to become Bethune-Cookman University, which remains a top-tier HBCU, Bethune-Cookman. In 1936, she was appointed to head the Division of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration. So, she makes her way into the administration, this position, Division of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration. At that time, there were tens of thousands of black people in the American Civil Service, that is, serving in positions in the American government. But that number is rapidly increasing. You don't have to memorize these numbers or write them down. But in 1933, there were 50,000 black people in the civil service, that is, working for the federal government. By 1941, it's 150,000. So the Roosevelt administration oversees a 300% increase in the number of black people who are working in positions for the federal government. She does Bethune, a member of the NAACP. In fact, she serves as vice president at one point. She serves as the president of the National Association of Colored Women. She founded a National Council of Negro Women. In 1937, she organized the Federal Council of Negro Affairs, or what's known as the Black Cabinet. A group of black policy advisors who would meet at her home, discuss, debate, coordinate policy matters, and would make recommendations specifically to Eleanor Roosevelt and advocate on the part of black people and say, hey, put this in the president's ear. Have FDR consider, X, Y, Z. We've been talking about this. We think you could get this done. Notable attendees are members of this so-called Black Cabinet. that we've talked about, I think I talked about in here before, and certainly will today, A. Philip Randolph of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the labor leader A. Philip Randolph. And then Walter White, who we'll also talk about here in just a minute. Bethune is one of the key figures that helps lead the march of black voters away from the Republican Party, which of course they've been drawn to in the days of emancipation and the Reconstruction Amendments. But realizing that the Republican Party had shifted its attention away from them and their concerns, and recognizing, of course, that in the South, the Democratic Party is a party of white supremacy, but also recognizing that outside the South, the Democratic Party, particularly through someone like Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, could be a vehicle for change. Bethune helps lead the march of black voters away from the Republican Party and towards the Democratic Party. 75% of the black votes cast in 1936 went to Roosevelt. That being said, you guys know that the only black member of Congress at that time was Oscar DePriest from Chicago. He actually loses to a Democrat in 1934, Arthur Mitchell, and Mitchell remains the only black person in Congress for the rest of the decade. Questions about that or anything else? Talk a little bit more about African American politics during this period. Black churches become increasingly political, and you have an increasingly blurred line between the religious and spiritual institutionally and the political. See, for example, Adam Clayton Powell, pastor at Harlem's Abyssinian Baptist Church. Adam Clayton Powell leads boycott campaigns in New York City in the 1930s, telling black people, don't buy where you can't work. See, again, reiterating from last lecture, we associate this kind of thing with the 50s and 60s and Martin Luther King and John Lewis. Well, here it is in the 30s. Using the power of the black dollar, Adam Clayton Powell telling black New Yorkers, don't buy where you can't work, don't go spend your money there if they're not going to hire black people. Housewives leagues also organize these kinds of boycotts, and not just in New York City either. But Powell gets elected to the New York City Council in 1941, and then to the United States House of Representatives in 44. So no longer would Mitchell be the only black representative in Congress. And that's Powell there at the top right. A. Philip Randolph, who we just mentioned, continues to advocate for interracial unionism, black and white workers coming together. He joins during this time the Socialist Party, the American Socialist Party, a party that believed in using the government to help redistribute wealth to the poor, and possibly even in more fundamental socialism, that is the government overseeing the social ownership of what we would call the means of production, that is collective ownership of factories or farms, or collective control over the banking industry and so on. Randolph had tried to organize elevator operators at one point. Back then, elevators were attended, an attendant in there that would select the floor for you, maybe carry your bags, whatnot. Those people were often, those jobs are often held by black people, as were jobs on the docks. If you worked in a port, taking containers on and off of ships and so on, you were what they call a stevedore, a dock worker. And Randolph had attempted to organize those people as well. under the umbrella of the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. The AFL at that time, though, was a racist and exclusive organization of white skilled workers, and Randolph's efforts fail for that reason. So in 1925, he becomes president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. I mentioned this before, thinking that I'd already introduced you to Randolph, and obviously had not. Back then, rail was the preferred means of travel, for long distances especially. And you had, of course, wealthy people who could get a room in a sleeping car, and it's like a motel room within the train, and you'd have an attendant, a porter, who could carry your bags in and out, bring you what we would now call room service and so on. And those people were often black. And Randolph organizes them into a union. And he used that union to advance the causes of workers' rights and specifically black workers' rights. Importantly, at the same time, you have the emergence of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO, in the mid-1930s. I mentioned that the AFL, the early successful National Labor Union, was not welcoming to black people, people of color in general, Latinos, women, even any unskilled worker, even white unskilled workers. The AFL was this elitist institution that only welcomed like workers with a specific skill. Not folks who just worked in a factory, pushing a lever or whatever. The CIO is different. The CIO was designed specifically to be much more inclusive and welcoming to unskilled workers, and not overtly hostile to immigrants or people of color or women and so on. That being said, black people still could face racism within local labor units under the umbrella of the CIO, but it was a hell of a lot better than it was under the AFL. See also the Socialist Party that I mentioned that Randolph joins. Beyond just Randolph, the Socialist Party gains a small black following, particularly in Harlem. And this makes sense because if you consider the aim of socialism broadly, generally speaking, was equality. Eliminating class divisions, upper, middle, lower class divisions. And so that kind of color blindness, if you will, and striving for some kind of equality had a significant appeal. There's also, though, the Communist Party USA, the American Communist Party, which is aligned with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union at the time, Russia, which offers a little bit more radical brand of socialism and had split, therefore, from the U.S. Socialist Party after the Russian Revolution of 1917. Communist Party USA was also committed to racial equality and even had a legal wing, a team of lawyers and attorneys that would take up civil rights cases in America. They get involved especially in the case of the Scottsboro boys. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. We talked about Socialist Party, Communist Party USA, how they split. They're both socialist. Communist Party is more radical, more directly aligned with the Soviet Union. But the case of the Scottsboro boys, and that's probably almost all we'll get to, we'll see. This will end up being a two-parter. These young men, incredible story. And I think we have scheduled a film to watch, so maybe I shouldn't go on and on and on because you'll see in the film. These 9 young men board a train, and I don't mean like as ticketed passengers. I mean they hop on. they're hobos on this train, which was not uncommon, coming out of Chattanooga in southeast Tennessee and going into northeast Alabama, riding around looking for work. On that train too were some hoboing white young men and a couple of white women. And this is the lifestyle. They ride around on trains, from camp to camp, and they were itinerants. They were listless. And the group of 9 black young men end up getting into a scuffle with the white boys, get the better of the white boys, who were then butthurt that they got beat up by some black guys, and then collaborate with the 2 white girls to get off the train at the next stop outside of Scottsboro, Alabama, and have the white girls go tell the local sheriff that they were raped by the black boys. Yeah. And in the South, at that time, an accusation of rape from a white woman to a black man typically led to a lynching. No trial, no charges brought, no questioning if the story was true or not. The word of the white woman was honor and truth. And so all those girls had to do is get off that train and say, yeah, these guys raped us. It's remarkable, and it almost became the case that they were just lynched on the spot. There's a trial held that I don't know, lasts like a day. There's a mob outside the courthouse calling for the lynching and the hanging of these young men. But instead they get legally lynched. They get quickly convicted. They had no representation, no attorneys, didn't even understand what the hell was happening to them at the time. The court, the judge is influenced, the jury's influence of all white people, by the way, by what's going on outside the courthouse. But they all but one, because he's too young, they all get sentenced to die. They all get sentenced to execution, death penalty. News of this spreads, though, and the NAACP quickly attempts to get involved. And eventually the Communist Party's legal people get involved. And with the representation of this man, Leibowitz, working for the Communist Party's legal arm, these young men get their cases thrown out. They get new trials, but the state fights it. The state of Alabama fights this for years. Now, eventually, all 9 of these young men are exonerated. And it comes to light that those 2 women were lying, flat out lying. And turns out, that they were disreputable, you might say, and that, courts had found that, the evidence that they'd been having sex with, they'd been at a hobo camp, the night before and having sex with their white boyfriend. It had nothing to do, no evidence was ever shown to connect these men in any way to raping this woman. And one of them just flat out admits eventually that it was all a concocted lie. So again, these 9 young men are eventually all exonerated and go free, but their lives are ruined. They spent, a decade and more in some cases before they got out. Their cases all kind of weave through the legal system differently. It takes years and years. But eventually the Supreme Court hands down some landmark rulings in their cases. In which it says, if you're charged of a serious crime like rape, you have the right to an attorney. Something we nowadays would just take for granted. Of course, you're Mirandized, right? Because the Miranda case, Miranda v. Arizona, where it says you have to, if you're charged or arrested, they have to read to you all of your rights, like the right to have an attorney. Well, back then you didn't have that. And even here, all they're saying is, if you're charged with something super serious like rape, you got to have an attorney and a competent representative. Which even when they initially gave these guys an attorney, he didn't give a shit about their case. Some local white Alabama guy. So the standard is established for these decisions that if you're charged with a serious crime, a capital crime, then number one, you have access to counsel even if you can't afford it. You can get an attorney to represent you. And you also can't, having an all-white jury if you're a black person is a violation of your right to equal protection. I mean, you can't just purposely put people like this on trial for capital crimes and intentionally have juries that are all white, and jury pools that are all white. If you remember, that's white supremacist Alabama in the 1920s, 30s. There were no black people serving on juries. All that makes sense? Mm-hmm. So that publicity, and then the trial gains national, international attention. Eventually the trials, multiple. That is a boon to the profile of the Communist Party USA, who is representing these men. Which also, the CPUSA also organized an Alabama Sharecroppers Union, a union of black farmers concerned with, of course, prices of commodities and naturally their own wages, and seeking an end to discrimination in New Deal programs. And so when a member of the union is arrested in Georgia for leading a biracial demonstration and charged with violating an anti-insurrection law, Communist Party USA successfully defends him. And the Supreme Court overturns the law as discriminatory. And finally, here, the National Negro Conference, when blacks in Harlem rioted and attacked white-owned homes and properties, and isn't this a new twist? Black people taking to the streets to violently vent their frustrations. Black leaders in New York City realized the need for a united black front, an umbrella organization, if you will. And so 800 delegates representing 500 different organizations meet in Chicago in 1936 and form the National Negro Conference. Some of the leaders of this National Negro Conference we have talked about. Recall from Tuesday, Alan Locke, the professor who influenced so many like Zora Neale Hurston to move to Harlem and be a part of the Harlem Renaissance. Ralph Bunche of Howard, Harvard PhD in political science and chair of the political science department at Howard, is among the early members. Ralph Bunche. And it becomes a robust institution pretty quickly with 70 chapters pushing for fair housing, for the hiring of black workers, for relief for black workers generally. Regrettably, it was doomed to infighting, especially between communists and labor and business and church leaders, all battling one another for influence. But it is an early example of black organizations coming together and attempting to present, again, a united front. We've only got a few minutes left here, and I don't want to short shrift Charles Hamilton Houston, so I guess we can push this to next time. Maybe we're all tired and exhausted anyway. Maybe that's where I fell short today, is trying to put too much information into one lecture. Should have done like my buddy LG and just told a bunch of stories about FDR and we could call that a day. But no. So yeah, we'll tack this on to the beginning of next lecture, talking about Charles Hamilton Houston and the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, Inc.